You're listening to an IOE podcast.
Powered by UCL Minds.
Welcome to one of our 50th anniversary events. It's really my great pleasure to be chairing this evening. Do try and get yourselves comfortable because we can't make it any cooler. There is more of a breeze here, so maybe that's why the room's a bit better. Make sure you keep yourself hydrated. So the eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that we've got 3 speakers rather than the advertised 4. Sadly, Paul Ramchandani has hurt his back at the weekend and can't make it, can't get to us. So wishing him a speedy recovery. The only silver lining to this is I was quite worried about keeping everything to time with 4 speakers. So still no hope with 3, but hopefully we will get to drinks and nibbles by around 7 o'clock. That is the intention. So this roundtable is the second of 3 such events in the programme of activities celebrating our 50th anniversary at Thomas Coram Research Unit. And each roundtable roughly maps onto one of our 3 research clusters. So we had a lovely event celebrating our migration cluster in February. There's a podcast available if you missed it. And today we're also creating a podcast of this event. So we are being recorded. If someone says something they really don't want saying, we can edit it before it goes out. But just to let you know that that's going on. But we are in person. We're not hybrid. And today we're celebrating our gender diverse families and work cluster. And then in September the 18th, as a date for your diaries, we're going to be celebrating Childhood and Children's Services cluster. We had our garden party last week. I think we got the weather the right way round. So that was very, very lovely. And then the final event, just another plug for your diaries, celebration of our 50th will be on 7th of November at Coram, another evening event, and that's be for our book launch for social research for our times. So to today, each speaker will talk for around 10 minutes or so, maybe a bit more, followed by questions and answers. And then the idea is we'll go around again to allow the panel to respond to each other and to the first round of questions, and then keep going until we hit around 7 o'clock. Coming just after Father's Day, today's roundtable will be an interdisciplinary conversation between 3 scholars who have been researching fathers for many years, and as also celebrating, of course, our 50 years of research at TCRU, which has a long history of research into fathers and fatherhood. And to plug the book again, Social Research for Our Times, is a very nice chapter in that, which celebrates exactly this. Indeed, one of the things that's really attracted me to coming to join TCRU was the depth of research in the area. I've been working on fathers and fatherhood since my PhD, being inspired by Margaret's work to start doing my PhD. I remember attending PhD workshops with Esther, and Paul is a newer father pal. But so I'm really delighted to be chairing today and to look forward to the conversation very much. So our first speaker, to introduce the speakers, is Margaret O'Brien, who we know very well, a Professor of Family and Child Policy, former Director of TCRU for 8 years until handing over the mantle to me in 2021. You're co-editor of The Father Figure, 1982, co-editor of Comparative Perspectives on Work-Life Balance and Gender Equality, Fathers on Leave Alone, 2017, and many other things we could list, but you're currently the Vice Chair of the EU COST project on parental leave and social sustainability, which if you're not part of at the moment, do have a look and see if you might like to sign up to. That runs until 2026. And then after Margaret, we'll be handing over to Paul Hodkinson, who is Professor of Sociology at the University of Surrey. He is co-editor of New Fathers, Mental Health and Digital Communication, that's 2021, and co-editor of Sharing Care, Equal and Primary Care, Fathers and Early Years Parenting, also 2021. You've been busy during the pandemic. And then turning to Esther. Esther is Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Bristol, author of Intimate Fatherhood, Sociological Analysis 2008, co-editor of Fathers, Families and Relationships, Researching Everyday Lives, that's 2018. I know there's many other things you've been involved with. You've been editor of the Families, Relationships, Societies Journal. There's a bit of a theme to that, to the panel. So previous editor, I've got the chair of the editorial board. Paul has published in FRS, and Esther. So do take a look at Families, Relationships, Societies Journal if you haven't seen that before. There was also a 2015 special issue on fatherhood, which you with Tina Miller. So I think without further ado, let's jump into the main event, the roundtable. And Margaret, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Alison. Perhaps I should have this. I got back late last night from Sicily. The plane arrived late into Stansted, so I'm a bit sleep deprived. Got in, I think, about 1:15. So apologies for not being at the great event today on gender equality I wanted to attend, but that's a context to my talk. And I'm going to speak a bit to my notes, which I don't usually do because I have PowerPoints and speak to those or write. But it's a great occasion to do something different on our anniversary. And on occasions such as this, it's important, obviously, to look back as well as to the future. Indeed, some argue that life is lived forward, but only understood backwards. And as I get older, I'm becoming more and more aware of that, acknowledging that I'm making sense of my life, looking back. And I'm speaking about my professional life and also my family life. My first book on fatherhood, as Alison mentioned, The Father Fig, edited with my dear friend and colleague Lorna McKee, was published in 1982, over 40 years ago, when I was just 28. And my PhD on lone fathers caring for children after separation, 2 years later, was conducted at the LSE, and it's great we've got some LSE people here today. It was in the social psychology department, so I've moved from social psychology to more of a social policy orientation in my working life. At the time, when I was younger, researching fatherhood was a minority topic in the social sciences. Some of our peer group couldn't understand the interest at all. We were really at seminars criticised quite heavily. They asked, what could men tell us about family life? Aren't they unreliable narrators, irrelevant subjects, distant or absent, and when at home, often asleep, or disciplinarians, or primarily oppressive to women and children. So it was a research topic to be avoided at all costs. You'll remember the influential anthropologist Margaret Mead's phrase about men and fatherhood. They were a biological necessity, but a social accident. That was sort of discussed quite a lot when I was in this period of my working life. And we know now from the work on biological changes in reproduction, particularly from Cambridge, many of the scholars here are part of that formation, that sentence, biological necessity, is now under contestation. My intellectual and indeed personal experience, however, was that fathers, like mothers, and indeed all humans, are very influential, particularly in the family groups they form and the relationships that they connect with and for. And at the same time, however, they're complex, contradictory, as well, as being influential. I experienced this at first hand in my own family group. I am the eldest of 4 children from an Irish migrant family. And our parents needed to navigate parenthood and work and jobs across 3 continents, doing what the scholars in America say, who are looking at fatherhood in the inner city, doing the best they could. And at one point in my early childhood, like many migrant children, I was sent back to the homeland, to the west of Ireland, to be looked after by my grandfather and a very dear auntie. And I have great memories of that time, particularly when I heard chickens, because there were a lot of chickens coming in and out of the front of the house, or the cottage, or the shack. Perhaps it was now. When I go back, it was pretty basic. So, but looking back with an academic lens, I was part in the 80s of this first wave of fatherhood research, as we called it, in the rich global north, as it's become labelled. We were discovering fatherhood. Part of a group led by Michael Lamb, globally really, and Michael was the father of fatherhood research. I don't know what other people would say. He was then at Yale. He talked about fathers being the forgotten contributors to family life. And we, Lorna McKee and I and others, wanted to give fathers a hearing, for them, give them space to discuss and describe their experiences. So we invited like-minded scholars from a range of disciplines, including law, history, epidemiology, psychology, sociology, who were interviewing and also conducting research in a more distant way with fathers and fathers-to-be. So we asked them to write about their empirical and theoretical insights. Many of these first-wave studies disrupted the normative stereotype that was around at the time, that men were disengaged, irrelevant, distant, and so on. Certainly the breadwinner model was questioned. So we had many accounts from in the chapters and also in our own work on men, as we called it then. We used the word nurturant. It's not used too much in the field now, but I suppose that the word and concept that's very prominent in our current academic inquiry is caring. So we, colleagues and us, we had accounts of caregiving in many settings. For example, one of the chapters and pieces of work was by a sociologist called Joel Rickman. He was a great, interesting scholar. He was very much influenced by Goffman. And he was working on men and pregnancy. And he talked about the heterogeneity of careers that men have when their partner's pregnant. And those of you who follow this field, you know that there's the Couvard syndrome that's discussed historically about the weight that men sometimes put on when their partner's having a baby. And the rituals that they may go through, and culturally, that's very well described in the anthropology of men and fatherhood. So he just noticed there's a real continuum and diversity in men's pregnancy careers, no homogeneity. Some were micromanaging, the embodied partner, her timings and her waves of change in her body. Others were completely disengaged and disinterested. And I think that theme comes up now in much of the scholarship. It's a constant. And similarly, an epidemiologist, Angela Brown, was doing cutting-edge work on fathers in the labour ward, because at that time, childbirth had moved from the home to the labour ward, and interviewing professionals, and also she was interviewing men and women and triangulating their accounts. And there was this theme in her work coming up as father as a non-functioning intruder. There was no place for him in the waiting, in that waiting and present space for the new baby. It's very interesting now. I have a daughter who is training in obstetrics and gynecology. So I talked to her about how she works with fathers or not. And during COVID, she was very cross with the men and the partners around the birthing woman, because she was thinking about infection. She didn't want the men to be in the room. And so we had these family arguments, really. Isn't birth a social event, not just a physical event? She learnt a bit further, I think, on that. We'll see, because the power of the consultant is very strong. So this first wave, actually then generated, was part of this amazing range of work. We've got Esther here with her extraordinary book, Intimate Fatherhood, in 2008. Julia Brannan, our colleague here in TCRU, on fathers in migration. We've got friends overseas. Andrea Duchette edited the Journal of Fathering. Sadly, it didn't go on for very long. We've got this new journal on family relationships and societies. There's advocacy throughout the world for men's place in families, in the caring sense. The State of the World Fathers Report. We have advocacy from the Fatherhood Institute, and Adrian Burgess has been really important in this. That organisation was formed during New Labour, 1997, where men's caring was on the agenda. We'll wait to see for the next election whether that will be the case. And, then we had paternity leave come into the UK in 2003. So what we have also now in terms of the discourses are, I suppose, more on the state, the confused state, as maybe Richard Reeves would say, the Brookings scholar, his book of Boys and Men, the fragmentation of identities for men in families and indeed life. Where am I? The women in my life are getting higher grades. I'm maybe not necessary anymore. Richard Reeves even suggests that boys should start school a bit later than girls, if those of you have read his book. He's quite an American model, although he's British. And of course we have Andrew Tate with the toxic masculinity issues. And I'm being a bit personal. Thankfully, he hasn't been convicted yet, but he is on the way. But those some of the statements and discourses around the difficulties that men are having, I think, are very important for us to capture. So our work is more on the benign side of fathering. I don't want to forget, however, that many family annihilations are conducted by the father. So you'll see in the field that researchers tend to move around either the good or the bad dad, even though that dichotomy is actually unhelpful. There's very important work on safeguarding of fathers now, and which talks about the inclusion of men being really important, because if you don't support the father, he may go on to act in a similar way with the next family. So there are some pragmatic and child-centered reasons for engaging fathers, as well as being engaged, thinking about their own identities as men and caring fathers. It's just 2 points by way of discussion that I'm going to highlight, and I've got more things to say, but I'm keeping them back. But I just want to raise 2 issues. When we were writing our chapter for the 50-year anniversary, and it was great that it was an intergenerational piece of writing. We had Julia, myself, Kitty, who's in the room, who's a postdoctoral scholar. We had 2 eminent, relatively new scholars, Charlotte Faircloth and Catherine Twomley, and we tried to make sense of TCRU's fatherhood research and the field more generally. And this chapter has been sent to our speakers today, and you'll see when you read that chapter that one of our preoccupations in TCRU, and generally I think in the field, this is my first point, is when is the second gender revolution going to happen? When is it going to happen? By that we mean during the 70s and onwards, women and mothers have increased their labour market paid participation. And the optimistic vision was men and fathers would move into the private sphere of family, and we'd have harmony. In fact, in our book, Lorna and I, we ended our book saying, when fathers become more involved in childcare, mechanisms of patriarchy will be dismantled. We were borrowing on Shorter, historian of the family at the time, or family life. That still is a really important theme in our work, and we try to understand patterning of it in writing the chapter. But I just want to raise the point, and for discussion, I'll come back to it, that actually it's only one lens for understanding fathering practices, institutions of fathering, fatherhood, fathers as individuals, as David Morgan very helpfully differentiated. And the data's there, indeed, that women's labour market participation has increased. In Britain, there's more working hours, paid working hours conducted by women and mothers, and men. But men and fathers have as I suppose you were talking about in the seminar today, have increased their care time. They've decreased their working hours. You remember in the 80s, British fathers were seen as the workhorses of Europe, as it was called, and they had very, very long weekly working hours. That's reduced to some extent, but if you look at the time use data, and that might be seen as rather non-nuanced, we haven't reached equity, equality. And I suppose I want to raise the question for our discussion, were we being over-optimistic to think that that was going to happen? Although there have been many books about it. I know Esther wants to talk about that. But still, it's a really important issue. And I've been reflecting on it and thinking that it's driven also now by women and mothers feeling so burdened, not only by the intensive mothering discourses that Charlotte so lovely, if there is a word, writes about, and Catherine and her work on. But there's also the paid working hours of women. Heather's work has shown has really intensified in Britain and in many countries over this period. So women are tired, mothers are fed up, and that's important to manage and reflect on. And the other issue I just want to flag now, and I'll come back to it in discussion, is something completely different, which is about the group globally of young men and men who are either rejecting fatherhood or can't become fathers, either through migration, not partnering with people they want to partner with because of the potential constraints of transnational family life. And also, and we have PhD students in the room, it's great people working on the really low fertility countries of the world, where it's not really, it's not really an achievement object or a life stage that many young men are wanting to move on to. So it appears, although we need more empirical work, it's great, we're looking at China, and we're looking at also some PhD work on low fertility, Japan and in South Korea. So what is it about parenthood that's turning possibly some men off? Richard Reeves thinks it's this issue about the rise of female dominance, although he claims to be a feminist. I think he's somebody that's worked very strongly on feminist work here in Britain when in the 80s. So I think there's a big problem here about men and women working together and speaking about different sex couples and how we form families. And, and if we need to, because of environmental reasons, that's another factor to think about clearly in terms of sustainability. But then if we look at elder care and the welfare system, we do need the next generation, unless it's going to be AI.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm honoured and slightly intimidated to speak alongside Margaret and Esther, who know enormously more about fatherhood than I do. I've been researching it an awful long time. It's really fantastic to be here. And congratulations to the research unit on its 50th birthday. It's really nice to be here to talk fatherhoods and families. So I think, sort of as you said at the beginning, I'm a sort of fairly recent convert to sort of fatherhood studies, if you want to call it that. And I think my sociological career has been a bit sort of following the stuff that I do. And it was when I became a father in 2011 that sort of started me thinking about this area and thinking about the kinds of questions that might be asked as part of research, as part of the area. And that ended up with, sort of two main bits of work that I've been involved in. The first was a two-phase, what became a two-phase longitudinal study of primary and equal carer fathers, those who are doing more than most, as it were. And the second was a study of new fathers and mental health, including collaboration with various sort of practitioners in relation to that too. And the first project was with my colleague Rachel Brooks, and the second was with my colleague Ranjana Das. I think what really sparked my interest was perhaps something that many men and perhaps women experience when they go through that process of sort of first pregnancy, if you like. The stark gender inequalities that myself and my partner experienced, felt like a real wake-up call in a, I guess, a relationship where we'd always been sort of largely equal and thought of ourselves as largely equal. Suddenly we found ourselves sort of placed into these very starkly different roles in a way that I don't think we were entirely prepared for, in spite of me being a sociologist and all of that. We aspired to parent equally or even with reversed roles that kind of fit in with the way that we saw ourselves, but were struck by how we were positioned during pregnancy and beyond, and how we kind of, in spite of probably thinking of ourselves as being quite sort of critical people and that kind of thing, ended up taking on aspects of those positionings in various ways. And so I think that was it. That was what sort of triggered my interest. And, there's a couple of anecdotes I could possibly go into later, maybe, but that'll do on that for now. So, with a particular focus on fathers, I guess I thought maybe I could explore that thing about how fathers in particular are positioned during the process of pregnancy and then in the various things that happen beyond that point. And the importance of that positioning for the roles that fathers might see as feasible or possible for them, and for their experience of becoming parents, including their well-being. So I've got a little subtitle here. I've got no slides, but I'm kind of so not used to not using slides that I'm doing my subtitles. So my subtitle is kind of Fathers as Marginal Supporters. So a thing across both of the research projects, which, in a way that the research projects were very different from one another, but a thing that came through really strongly from both of them was the way in which many fathers talked about feeling a bit kind of marginal and in a sort of awkward liminal position during the process of pregnancy, and particularly at various sort of the sort of key points, like scans and the birth itself and various other sort of situations. And that's sort of also been found by sort of various other studies too. So John, one of the participants in one of the projects, says, I went to most of the antenatal classes, I went to the midwifery appointments, and you very much sit in the chair at the side of the room as a passive observer. You don't actively participate in what's going to happen. And various people sort of said kind of similar things about various sort of stages along the way in the process. And it, maybe connects to that thing about, previously fathers weren't invited into the birth. They were sort of wandering around the waiting room or whatever, and they weren't particularly sort of going to scans either for various reasons. So now they are invited in, except for during COVID, of course, which is interesting in itself. But they're rarely sort of spoken to, and if they are, it's in their status as kind of observer, supporter, possibly almost like a hospital visitor, but not, something more than that, but this kind of slightly odd marginal position. So others said similar things about midwife visits, but then also sort of later on about sort of encounters with doctors, nurseries, and who they want to have contact with and who they don't want to have contact with, schools, who they want to contact in relation to children and who they sort of position as the sort of primary parent in that respect. So another participant in much more recent research, the second phase of my research with Rachel on primary care and equal care of fathers, Anthony says they have a preference, I think, to deal with the mother. We've noticed it at both the school and the nursery. I went and filled out all the paperwork, so I put my details first, but they've always only ever contacted my partner. He does say it's less apparent now with school than it was, say, with health visitors and midwives and all that earlier. So he's indicating there is maybe some improvement in sort of how he feels positioned, but still there's this kind of marginality, there's this kind of on the side of things in terms of how he's positioned. And crucially, there's all sorts of other ways that we could sort of broaden this much more into the various other ways in which both fathers and mothers are positioned in particular ways. So we could think about other parents and how they might position one another. And so in the case of sort of primary or equal care of fathers, other mothers often want to communicate with their partner rather than them about their children, to organise play dates, to organise parties and various other things. Again, sort of reinforcing centrality of the mother, reinforcing kind of marginality of father in various ways. And, you know, we could go on. So workplaces obviously have a critical role to play in terms of the role that fathers have. Fathers' families, fathers' peers, media, whole huge sort of area in terms of how fathers are sort of presented through media, through marketing of various kinds and so on. And policy, of course, as well. The UK's shared parental leave scheme, people probably know, kind of institutionalised the mother as central and the father as marginal by having a system where the leave by default is the mother's, and it has to be kind of transferred to the father if they want to sort of take shared parental leave. And I guess maybe what's really interesting is that, of course, fathers themselves and mothers internalise all of this in various ways. And then, you know, I think what came out in some of our research, at least, is the ways in which that partners kind of reinforce such things through the roles that they take up and their interactions with each other in relation to those roles, even if they sort of don't want to. And I think perhaps, you know, some people have talked about maternal gatekeeping, the notion that mothers sometimes prevent fathers from sort of taking on more work. But I think Tina Miller is right to say it's much more a process of sort of mutual reinforcement that's sort of taking place really between partners in quite sort of complicated ways sometimes. So yeah, kind of I guess this notion of marginality and sort of positioning fathers as marginal I think is sort of interesting and something that could be explored more. So what consequences does that have then? And I guess I'm just going to sort of use some examples from our research. So mental health, I thought I'd deal with firstly. Maybe that's the less obvious one of the two that I'm going to talk about. So Ranjana and I found when we were researching fathers who had suffered from mental health difficulties after or during the process of having a baby, the lack of preparation and support for fathers, as fathers, in terms of them and what the process meant for them, along with their internalisation of this sort of marginal positioning as the supporter, could have quite dire implications for their ability to cope with and deal with mental health problems when they arose for them, often after having a baby. So there was a sense of, it's not about me. In fathers' narratives, it's not about me. This is not supposed to be about me. It's not okay for me to be having struggles at this point. This is not supposed to be about me. It's definitely not okay for me to require support of any kind at this point. It's not about me. So, yeah, fathers are kind of scripting their struggles, we thought, through what we called repertoires of illegitimacy. It's not the feelings that I'm having are not legitimate at this time. And that then sort of connected with this kind of coming in of sort of masculine stoicism in the face of struggle, and that feeling like an essential thing to do at that particular moment, that one has to struggle through, one has to be stoic, in order that everyone else and themselves can focus on the needs of mother and baby. And this was the case even for fathers who presented themselves as not very masculine fathers, who like talked about sort of sharing their feelings with people quite a lot of the time. So John says, so those feelings I didn't really feel that I could share with my wife or anyone because I felt guilty about having them. Before, I've suffered stressful breakups of relationships and you go and cry on your mum's shoulder. Whereas this time I felt that I couldn't seek that because the centre of attention should be my wife rather than me. So for us, there's a connection between that and all that we're saying to fathers about what their position and role is during this kind of process. It's not about me. I'm not at the centre of this. I shouldn't be at the centre of this. So, you know, that then sort of leads to feelings of failure, spirals of guilt, struggles to come to terms with things, and significant struggles seeking support. So how about caregiving roles then, and that sort of positioning of fathers? As Margaret sort of said, there's lots of research that has quite rightly shown increasing numbers of fathers aspiring to have sort of intimate connections and extensive involvement with their children, and in many cases doing so to a significant extent, but normally still in the role of secondary carer, not sort of getting over that sort of line that there actually is a kind of equality, or that they're sort of going further still and being sort of primary carers. It's kind of like the, I don't know if people remember this, but there was an Alexa advert. Does anyone remember the Alexa advert where there was a father who took one day caring for his partner's baby? Oh, no, never mind. It's an interesting advert. It depicts him in a very kind of quite sort of sympathetic, generous way. He's shown to be very competent with the baby, very caring. He has an intimate connection with it very clearly. He's working super hard. He's super committed. But it's the one day, and Alexa has to convey to him instructions on what he's supposed to do at different times, because he's clearly not the main carer. So he's kind of intimately connected. There's all of this stuff going on that's very, very positive, but ultimately he's still sort of secondary carer sort of thing. Interestingly, the equal primary caregiver fathers that we talked to in our study also started their fatherhoods in that secondary role in most cases. And it was unusual circumstances that normally had enabled their horizons to shift away from that marginality to enable them to sort of envisage taking on a role which did get towards that sort of equal position or further. So redundancies, partners having particular struggles at home, partners sometimes finding that they were unable to work part-time when they went back to work, lack of nursery availability, various other sort of things that had come up that had sort of changed things and prompted fathers to sort of take on these unusually sort of intensive caring roles. And then after an initial steep learning curve, fathers had come to embrace these roles very extensively in a way that somewhat surprised us, I suppose. Very wide-ranging responsibilities and coming to see themselves as largely interchangeable with their partners in various respects in a way that we found quite striking. And in our most recent research, we found that such roles had proved enormously durable too, through various sort of challenges and changes across sort of a period of 5 years between the different phases of our research. Nevertheless, there were still ways in which even these unusual fathers sort of still had that kind of marginality in some respects. So they did have significant struggles to connect either on or offline with networks of other parents, most of whom were mothers in terms of the more active people in their communities. Anything from taking toddlers to playgroups to navigating parent WhatsApp groups was a big challenge and one that many of the fathers really struggled with and some kind of gave up on. So Robert says, she typically has a closer relationship with these women than I do, so the net result is it's always a bit easier for her to be doing the contacting. And they also had struggles with institutions that expect to communicate with mothers. So another father says, I think my wife tends to take the lead with those people. I think that's partly because that's the expectation on the part of the people offering those services, so it's just easier for her to lead those conversations. So in spite of how far they had come, and they had come an awful long way, fathers' involvement in what Andrea Doucette calls community responsibility parts of parenting was very limited in most cases, and much of that was deferred to their partners, even if the father was the primary carer in most other respects. And their role in parental organisation and decision-making, what Gillian Manson calls executive responsibility, also tended to be lower than their partners in many cases. And again, that was even sometimes when they were doing most of the kind of everyday caregiving. And there was kind of a broader sense that even if the father was doing most of the everyday care, their partners kind of were still seen as the default primary carer. So like, if all other things were equal, she would probably be doing it kind of thing. And that was sort of interesting too. So there was this still sort of sense of ambivalence about their role, even though they were in other ways very, very committed to it. So partly that links to sort of specific barriers to do with communicating with other parents and with institutions, but we also think it has a lot to do with the longer term marginal positioning of fathers, and to do with the intense pressures on mothers, not only to be the primary carer, but to be responsible for particularly sort of intense, expanded versions of what mothering is, which Charlotte Faircloth and various other people have sort of written about so effectively. So, very quick conclusion, sorry. There's lots of grounds for optimism. There's quite a lot of negative stuff I've talked about, I suppose. But our study, I think, did show that once established, equal and primary care roles among fathers can endure quite effectively through various challenges and changes. And that suggests maybe it's really worth us getting what happens at the start of the process as right as we possibly can, in terms of policy, preparation, support, and all of this stuff about how we're positioning people. There's also, in our work with health visitors and various others, we found all sorts of signs of sort of positive change going on there, albeit against very sort of scant resources, and hints perhaps of better support for fathers and leave in some workplaces too. But much more to be done, I think, to overcome how the positioning of fathers makes it hard to navigate well-being challenges, as I've said, and also creates challenges developing, obviously, more equal care and work roles. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. I may have to slightly steal your poster and cut the top off it, because I also am 50 years in 2023. So maybe I'll keep it as my own little kind of banner for my birthday later in the year. And it's slightly odd to have this opportunity to reflect back and realizing that I've been studying fatherhood for about 25 years. Not on my own, but collaboratively, and most notably with Tina Miller. But yeah, so hopefully, picking up on some of what Margaret said, I am going to look back a little bit at some of my earlier work and kind of ideas, and think a little bit about how they may have changed, moved on, or perhaps we're still asking the same questions, and I haven't really moved on in 25 years of doing academic work, so that's a bit depressing. Maybe just to say something a little bit about when I started research. So I have to say that Margaret's work was, as Alison said as well, was, really important work that I read when I first was interested in fatherhood. I don't know if that makes you feel worse. Old, I'm sorry. I think the other work that I read that was really interesting was Davidoff and Hall's Family Fortunes. So the socio-historical kind of work around middle-class men, Victorian and our 20th century, into the 20th century Victorian era, if I remember correctly. And some of that was about saying, we've actually got ideas of masculinity and fatherhood a little bit wrong, and actually, there's lots of accounts of men expressing emotions about their role as fathers, but it's just not captured in very public ways. It's captured in diaries and very kind of personal kind of accounts. So I think that, along with Margaret's very positive idea that perhaps fatherhood could be the route towards greater gender equality, inspired me. And then the third element that I think got me interested in fatherhood was perhaps a little bit more strangely. So I worked as a research assistant on a project on lesbian parenting. And that project made me realize further the absence of fathers in lots of accounts, but also that the lesbian parents in that study were doing equal parenting in really interesting ways, and in ways in which kind of challenged some of the economic accounts that that mothers and fathers seem to justify for their inequality. So the one that I often kind of quote to people is the idea that, oh well, if men can earn more than women, then it makes more sense for fathers to be full-time workers and women to either, as mothers, to either stay at home with children or to work on a part-time basis. Financially, that just makes sense. And the lesbian couples would say, okay, yeah, we need to make sure, we also care about economics, but actually it makes much more sense for both of us to work part-time, because then we're not putting all our eggs in one employment basket. And one person isn't giving up on their career and having to take a big career break, which will damage their career in the future. So a different way of making an economic argument without the same gendered expectations that resulted in quite different patterns of work and care. And so all of those things together were what kind of inspired me to think, well, what is actually happening with fatherhood in the late 1990s, I guess, by this point. And I suppose then, so I'll kind of throw out a few slightly disparate thoughts, perhaps. But maybe I'll say up front what I think are the big questions, maybe, that we can discuss a little bit further, or that the audience might like to engage with, which I guess are, what counts as change in fatherhood or fathering practices, and what makes change happen? And I think Margaret and Paul have also already talked about some of those things, but to me, those seem to be really important questions. As a sociologist, maybe they're important kind of questions if you're trying to think about social transformation and kind of in any setting. So I don't think they're unique to fatherhood, but I think there's something that kind of hold together some of my research kind of over the period. And I guess I have been a little bit eclectic in how I've researched fatherhood. So I've been involved in qualitative projects and as well as quantitative projects. I've moved a little bit more into social policy. I've worked with some social geographers, some psychologists, more recently people in human computing interaction who are actually really socially kind of interesting in terms of how they think about work, social work, interdisciplinary work about kind of creative methods for understanding fathers' experiences. So I'm a little bit, Janet of all trades? I don't know, perhaps whatever the appropriate name is for that. So a little bit eclectic. But to go back to, when I wrote Intimate Fatherhood, I began the book. I went back and looked at the introduction last week. We haven't looked at that for a very long time. And I started with a little anecdote. I was sitting in a seminar which was actually about migration and ethnicity, nothing to do with fatherhood. And what struck me was that the two male presenters both referenced their parenting and their fatherhood status as by way of a kind of an aside in their introductions. So one took out a watch, maybe not a mobile phone back in the day, to check his time. And it was a child's little blue kind of kiddie watch style. So he mentioned that he'd had to kind of borrow it from his son that morning in order to do that. And then the other presenter talked about how his productivity as an academic had gone down since having children. And what struck me was that both of those was an aside, wasn't anything to do with their talk, and it was mentioned, albeit in the rarefied atmosphere of an academic seminar room, as in quite a normal way, that this wasn't anything particularly exciting or revolutionary. And so I suppose what I was documenting through both qualitative study that had been done with interview-based study with fathers, but also some quantitative survey analysis about fathers' time in employment, was to try, or what I guess I can kind of conclude it, was that fathers were talking about doing things really differently. Now, admittedly, Margaret had already said that almost a generation previous to that, fathers talked about doing things differently. But I thought this was a different generation who were really doing things differently. So these fathers talked about that they were doing things differently to their fathers, that they were more engaged, that they were understood their children, they were doing lots more activities, sometimes that they were doing things differently to their peers or their siblings. They might not be doing as much as their wives or female partners were, but they were at the kind of the vanguard of what they were doing. Not all the fathers, there were a few fathers who were exceptional, but even the fathers who wanted to adhere to a more, inverted commas, traditional breadwinning father, still kind of positioned themselves as being a little bit unusual in doing that. That wasn't kind of typical. They viewed themselves as, one I think described himself as a bit of a dinosaur for not, for having a kind of a split between a stay-at-home mother and a very long hours working lawyer father. But what seemed, that seemed to be a change that they felt, and that was documented as well in some of the survey data about activities. What was causing the change? Well, I wasn't kind of quite sure what was causing the change, but the argument that I put forward was it was largely women that were causing the change. It was mothers. So that lots of this was driven by mothers who did not want to be stay-at-home mothers and were demanding greater involvement from their partners. Or it was a feminist ideology, a feminist kind of commitment from both men and women that actually, a little bit like Paul, you talked about, I don't know if you describe it as explicitly feminist, but a commitment, an explicit commitment to equality that had existed prior, that they wanted to then maintain and would work and kind of commit to doing things to make sure that that happened. So it didn't happen as part of the mainstream. It had to be kind of quite strongly worked towards. Then I, did some of the more general other work on kind of parenting. I think wanted to not perhaps research fatherhood whenever I was early in the stages of being a parent myself. I think that was, or maybe my partner wasn't so keen on the continuing research about fatherhood at that point. And I think, although I worked on fatherhood in kind of other ways, I didn't really come back to it for a few years. And so I'm gonna make it as if that was the 2015 special issue, although I was doing work between then. The 2015 special issue that Tina Miller and I put together and also wrote on as well, I guess I came into that special issue feeling a little bit annoyed because kind of going and looking at all the fatherhood research that had been done since I'd written, I felt that there were lots of accounts and we were all still kind of saying the same thing. And in fact, Tina and I went to a conference and we were asked by an eminent sociologist of the time, well, is there anything really new here going on? And we were quite offended at the time. But actually, I think it was a good question. Was there anything new? So there were numbers of other accounts saying, well, we're doing things differently from the previous generation. And lots of other fathers still saying, continuing to kind of say the same thing. And I felt a little bit annoyed by that. And I think then I shifted to suggest that perhaps what could make the change a little bit better was the policy angle. So again, I was just following Margaret into kind of like them researching parental leave. So that perhaps parental leave, not just at the highest policy level, but at the institutional, the management, the organisational level, that was where we could push a gender equality, and not just a gender equality, but actually a positive fatherhood agenda and make the difference, rather than having to rely on feminist sensibilities from individual sets of couples, which was maybe a bit unlikely. So I decided that maybe policy could be where we would focus. And Tina, who's a much more positive person, I think, than me generally, persuaded me, or through discussion, we kind of worked that, well, maybe there had been some significant change over the previous decade or so, but that rather than this the massive revolution which hadn't taken place, maybe there had been some element of evolution or a dissolution on some of the worst aspects of gender divisions of labour and of care. So we tried to think about, well, maybe we could think about change as being some durability of some of those shifts, so that those kind of ideas that fathers, there's an expectation about involvement at birth and in early years. There's an expectation and a taken for grantedness about fathers' involvement in small ways, at least, on kind of early level kind of child care. That perhaps a durability of that over time, we should think of that as being a significant change, so that it's incremental, but if we take those incremental shifts together, then it's more than the sum of its parts, was the phrase that we used. So perhaps policy might be a good lever, and actually lots of little changes sitting together. Maybe I shouldn't be kind of quite as negative as I had been before. And we did try and think a little bit about employment practices and pitched that changes to employment practices weren't sufficient, work with a little bit with economic geographers, because the idea was that although that might be a prompt into a different kind of activity, Paul talked about some of the fathers you interviewed through experiences of unemployment, that being a kind of a catalyst, but that and on a short-term basis, that shouldn't be enough. We'd have to see a durability of changed practices over time after a period of, for example, unemployment, in order to feel that a change had been significant. And I'm afraid I've gone on way too long, I think. This is the problem of not timed notes. Okay. So, sorry, everybody. It's really hot, and I've gone, aren't you lucky there's not 4 people now? So one final kind of thought, and it's not really a conclusion, but I suppose it's something that I've been thinking about more recently, is about where do we look for change? And we did say a little bit about this in a special issue a while ago. But I worry a little bit that as fatherhood researchers, we have a tendency to look towards the most privileged fathers as if they are the ones who are going to be doing things that are exciting and different. And I think, I may have even written this, that if you've got all the resource and privilege and advantages, well then maybe that is where the change will happen. And I think perhaps Gillian Ransom, don't want to say that she definitely said that because I might have made it up, may have argued that as well. But I think we're kind of doing a disservice to fatherhood studies as a whole if we focus on the professional white global north Guardian reading, kind of fathers, who are doing some kind of shared care. That's not to dismiss your work, Paul, at all. Sorry, that's it is. But I think that there's an interesting question about which fatherhoods, plural, we study. So most recently, I've been working again with Tila on a project around migrant Syrian fathers and the way in which they, to the UK, to England, and the way in which they think about fatherhood and do fatherhood, which does challenge some of these ideas about, fatherhood is a new involved activity, because these men are doing lots of different kinds of involvement with their children, if you captured activities, but they're not entirely happy about it because it's not reflecting the kinds of fatherhood and particularly the level of financial support that they really want to be able to provide for their children. So who are we talking about when we talk about fathers? Maybe that's another question. And not just actually that we focus on some of the privilege, but then there, I think sometimes there's a tendency also to focus on the most marginalised. So that's where I can kind of criticise myself as well. So that, do we focus on those who are most marginalised, most difficult, and that actually lots of the everyday fatherhood activities isn't captured very well in our qualitative research. And I know there are people around the room who have done research in that area. But what picture can we capture? And then another final challenge is that if we have lots of diverse fatherhoods, is it meaningful to think about fatherhood in the singular at all?
Thank you, Esther. Thanks. Thank you all. That was great. What I propose now is to take questions from the floor and not let the panel answer them, but to rather collect up and then we'll go around again for your individual responses and see how many times we get through that over the next half an hour. So, who wants to kick off? Any thoughts? Yes, Alison has offered to bring the mic round. Yeah. Well done.
Hi there, I'm Rob Trainer. I'm an administrator here at UCL, so I'm here through the PACT network, so I'm a parent and a carer. I was really interested in all of what you were saying, but one question that came into my mind was, and you were hinting at it strongly at the end, how things got worse the last few years. And I'm thinking about the gig economy. Lots of people, just, here at UCL, we found out that our security staff, for example, are about to be, there's going to be a wave of redundancies, but they're working 60 hours a week because they're outsourced. And I don't think anybody here, who's employed by UCL directly is working that many hours. So some of them are going to be fathers. And that, of course, means that, how are they going to put the same amount of time, effort and resources into their children if they're in that situation? So there's been a massive rise in that over the last decade or so. So I'm just wondering if that is showing in the research as well. So I guess that's my question. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, thank you. Could you say your name?
Hi, I'm Catherine Hill from the Centre for Research in Social Policy at Loughborough University. We do a lot of work on sort of living standards and sort of I've done quite a lot of low-income families. I'm doing a study at the moment, not necessarily on fathers, but it's on non-resident parents, by nature that a lot of those are fathers. I'm just interested, you sort of touched on sort of the social policy, but the social security system, I'm just interested in your thoughts on that, because for non-resident parents, it doesn't really support them being a parent because they're classed as a single person, and particularly for people on low incomes, on universal credit, for example, they're only entitled to single accommodation, help with single accommodation. So I was just sort of interested in sort of thoughts on social policy from the social security system side of things, and what your views are, if any, on that side of things.
Great question, thank you. Oh, this one, just
give your name as well. Thanks. My name's Jessica Hobbs. I'm a PhD candidate at Birkbeck College. And Paul, you mentioned about father's mental health, particularly in perinatal period, and about not feeling able to seek support, and even those who are able or do seek support, we're aware that particularly mental health support services are really stretched, and perinatal support services, health services are really stretched. So even if they did seek support, it might be difficult to obtain. I'm just wondering, in your various researches of fathers, if there are things that you've observed that they can or could do that can promote their own well-being without needing to rely on the support of others. Thanks.
thank you. Should we collect another question if there is one? Okay. I invite the panel to respond to those questions, but also to pick up on each other's reflections. Margaret, would you like to?
Yeah. I'd like to thank you for the questions. Really interesting. And on the diversity of fathers, that's really important. And in the field, and certainly in parental leave research, we're also highly aware of the polarisation issues that you've described, both in terms of employment precarity and also family change, separation, multiple changes and so on. And even within, for example, some profiling we've been doing with NatSen, represented in the room, we see great heterogeneity for non-residential fathers in Britain. We've done some national profiling. And just on that one, that you have some men who have children abroad, as well as out of the UK, as well as here, non-residential fathers. You have, this sort of co-parenting model, and non-residential fatherhood is increasing, as non-residential motherhood. Non-residential motherhood there's more normative, I think, work to do for women on still centralising their maternal identity in our culture. So there's a lot of work, research to draw on. It doesn't help the policy inequalities that we have in Britain, which are just awful at the moment. For example, on parental leave for fathers and mothers, those of you that look at our leave, you could have a look at our Leave Network publication that Alison's very involved in, and others in the room, Peter Moss and so on. You'll see that we are so down the league in terms of providing income replacement for even those that are eligible to receive paternity leave, parental leave. So the gig workers that you've mentioned, if they're a man and would like to take paternity leave, and they don't meet the criteria, for example, of secure employment, and for 26 weeks before the arrival of the baby, by the 15th week before delivery, they actually don't have access to the lower paid option, which is a maternity allowance that women have access to. So last government, New Labour, Ed Balls was pushing this through for fathers in Britain, low-income dads, to get access to this, to a paternity allowance in the way that mothers have. I mean, it's paltry. It's £156 a week. It's a bit more than the minimum wage, a bit more than the sickness benefit, but it's something. So I think that access to parental rights and access to holidays, all of those basic provisions are being dismantled by the new economy of, what does one call it? The new economy of neoliberalism. I don't know what it is. It's more than neoliberalism now. It's every man or woman person for themselves in many ways. That's just my pessimistic view just now.
Yeah, I think I was going to say something a little bit similar on that one, just that you asked Margaret about, that where is the second revolution kind of thing, and it could be that, women doing more work worked for neoliberalism and capitalism in various ways, you could possibly argue. Men doing less work probably doesn't work so well for neoliberalism and capitalism, which I guess means that policy has to do something about it and has to intervene in various ways. But yeah, it's a very good point about the gig economy and where is the prospect of realistically, finding the way to have the time and the space and the energy for fathers to become more involved in that circumstance. I thought I should answer the one about, thanks for the question about fathers and mental health. Especially thank you, because it made me think about how my talk was very much sort of rendering these fathers as quite passive in the face of everything that they were faced with, and actually in various ways they weren't, and I mean they did struggle very significantly with various things, but many of them did sort of find ways of coping gradually, and one of the things that we looked at in the research particularly was their use of sort of digital resources of one kind or another. And this absolutely wasn't some kind of magic panacea or anything like that, but some had found that the ability to just sort of on their own search for information and that kind of thing was massively useful. And there are various sort of fathers that have suffered mental health difficulties that do blogs and have become activists and that kind of thing, and many of them found that useful. Various different ways of kind of semi-disclosing as well online, sometimes to strangers, sometimes to people that they knew, sometimes in kind of coded ways. Sort of posting an article about fathers and mental health without any comment, for example. And, this one guy sort of gave us, it's quite a heart-rending story, actually, about how he posted this thing in the and he said this was deliberate, right? He wanted someone to notice that he was posting this thing and to sort of say something or to reach out to him. Nobody did, so it was quite a sort of disappointing thing. But there were various things like that, and there were other cases where it sort of had worked, and they had sort of found sort of groups of people to talk to, and that had then sort of led to them to seek professional help and so on. So yeah, there were various things that they did, and I think most of them did become somewhat proactive, although it didn't always kind of get them the kind of support that they wanted. And of course it doesn't replace the need for proper support, not just after it's happened, as it were, or while it's happening, but sort of in the preparation. And there are various sort of campaigners on this who just are sort of campaigning for the notion that fathers should just be asked if they're doing okay at certain points during the process, which generally sort of doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thanks. Jumping on the last one, first of all, but the answer is not really so much in relation to mental health, but it is about the idea of peer support networks, which I think there's certainly good research from other areas in workplaces about places where fathers can be open about the difficulties that they find as a father. And again, that's a kind of a normal conversation over, don't really have water coolers anymore, but the equivalent of that. People are in the office, shared experiences. So a kind of an acceptability, a willingness for middle managers, other people to talk about their own experiences and to kind of to share that, and that can build useful peer support networks, which then, as Paul says, means that an openness and you get something back, and it's even a bit of understanding, although obviously that's not going to resolve significant mental health issues, but it does, it means prompt something about not being so isolated, I guess, in those spaces. And there has been some work, Lars Planten in Sweden, and I was going to say that there's a kind of a fatherhood bingo thing, which is that it's really unusual if people are talking about fatherhood research and no one's mentioned a Nordic country explicitly. So I think I kind of fail. I didn't know if it was a challenge to not say Sweden in the middle of it. And maybe on that it kind of goes. So then to move around the other questions, I think unless we have some kind of state recognition of the need for supporting care, and let's just say care broadly, not just parents, but all forms of kind of care, that it can't be entirely rely on people buying care in order to work very, very long hours, then we can't have a kind of sustainable sets of kind of familial relationships, family ties, whether that's about fathers or whether it's people looking after elderly care issues, and more social democratic kind of setups show the way that can be done a bit better. Is it all a bit depressing at the minute? Yes, probably. And then the question more at the back around living standards. So a little while ago, now I did write something about non-resident fathers and poverty, and argued that actually, not that all non-resident fathers are living in poverty, but that they are a kind of probably an unacknowledged poor group. That for those who are poor, have a lot of difficulties, and not just financial poverty, but also social exclusion, and that those kind of seem to sit together, at least in the survey that we did, or the PSE Poverty and Social Exclusion Survey. Excuse me. On the separating parents issue, though, I would just say that, again, one of the issues is that if you have relatively low income before you separate as a couple, then both resident and non-resident partners are going to find it very difficult to maintain a standard of living for themselves and their children across two households. So, and I think there's been good research done by Gingerbread, by others as well. I don't think the solution is that resident parents are sitting in luxury and have got lots of money, and non-resident parents aren't. It's actually, which I'm being slightly flippant there, and I don't mean to be, but I was at there was a discussion about child maintenance recently in a special House of Commons committee, where that was kind of slightly the framing, like, oh, well, maybe we should just reduce child maintenance because that would make non-resident fathers' lives easier. But also that doesn't resolve poverty issues for children and resident parents. So again, I don't think we can kind of do anything unless we have kind of better levels of state support, whether it's through children or directly, or, you know, at least not to target those around, you know, what kind of housing situation, you know, we're into those kind of debates. And maybe some of those wider social policy, political debates are beyond today's discussion, but...
Thank you, Esther. Okay, I think we've got time for another round. I know you're probably melting over there in the corner. Ask a question, it'll wake you up. Oh, Charlotte.
Do that annoying thing of more of a comment than a question. But just to kind of pick up on what Esther said, I really appreciated that call for kind of a more stratified approach to care, because I think quite a lot of the discussions have been about the early stage of, you know, babydom, parental leave. But actually, you know, a lot of the research that you have all done as well is sort of pointing to the fact that it's when children move into sort of childcare that actually a lot of these sort of gendered inequalities get really entrenched, because certainly in the UK it is so astronomically expensive, and that sort of sets up these patterns of, you know, employment. But also to kind of, you know, call on a Scandinavian example, I just wanted to sort of ask the panel's thoughts on changing conceptions of childhood, or the child, and how that might influence some of the debates that we've been having today. And the example I'm thinking of is having recently been out in Denmark with some colleagues there who are looking at sort of, you know, early childhood and education. They're sort of recognising that there's a shift going on, such that policymakers are now feeling a little bit uncomfortable with how well embedded childcare is into their infrastructure, and sort of going, actually, is this what's best for children? Or is it, you know, are we just doing what's best for adults? And of course I was like, oh God, no, like we all look to you as like, you know, the shining example, because at least in my head, when you have such amazingly well subsidised childcare, it enables men and women to live full lives as citizens, you know, beyond just their roles as parents, because what I see, at least in the UK, is this kind of pushing down of the responsibilities onto individual couples that then sort of causes these very tense sort of interpersonal negotiations and, you know, these sort of stories of resentment or gender inequality or whatever, rather than this more sort of stratified approach where if we took a social responsibility for childcare, it would actually take the pressure off men and women. So as I say, it's not really a question, but it was just to sort of ask your thoughts on how you think the conception of the child has maybe changed over the last 50 years and how that sort of influenced some of the things you've worked on.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. Slightly more micro question, I think. Hard to follow, Charlotte. You talked about same-sex parents and research with same-sex female parents, and just sort of anecdotally, there are quite a lot of same-sex parents at my children's school, and we have conversations about the gender roles and the sort of split between work and responsibility and primary caregiving for children. And I wondered, sort of those conversations tend to reflect more traditional gender roles where one person within that same-sex couple will sacrifice their work and their career in the interests of sort of serving the children. And I wondered how the sort of broader research fits with that, but then also wondered more about how same-sex couples, where both people are fathers, plays into this relationship.
I'm going to take chair's privilege, if that's all right. So the cost action we're part of is around social sustainability is the core sort of theoretical framing that we're trying to work out what it means. So we've been thinking about that a little bit. And I wondered, in terms of, in answer to your question, what counts as change, something that came up the other day was why I think I've been struggling with the concept of social sustainability is, if you think about ecological sustainability, we know what we want to keep, I mean, the planet. But with social sustainability, a lot of the time we focus on the problems or what's not working. And so we don't want to keep that. So it doesn't work if you think directly. So then how about actually if you flip it, that what do we want to keep about the way, what things are working, or what things are better than, or what things are different, and what do we need to do to make those things, once we've identified them, sustainable. So focusing, I'm doing a Tina, focusing on what the positive, so that we can, flipping it in that sense. That would also help me with my social sustainability. Thank you. Any other? Okay, Esther, do you want to start? We'll go back down the other way this time.
Okay, thank you. So Charlotte's question or comment. I mean, I think I'm with you, and I'm not sure that we have very good evidence that we're being unfocused or uninterested in children by that kind of structure. But maybe there is something to explore there. I'm going to jump on kind of two elements of your comment to say something maybe a little bit different. So one, I do think that we still also have a lot of focus in fatherhood research on very early years, and perhaps, preschool and then kind of primary school. And I do think there's there's at least a question about, is there something interesting to look at fathers and their older children into secondary school, teenage, post-school age? What are those relationships? What does care and dependency and responsibilities look like at that stage? But then also, I think perhaps into kind of adulthood, and maybe that flips some of the questions, so that if we're thinking about relationships between parent and children, about kind of intimacy and a relationship and positive relationships over a period of time that are dynamic, that's also the positive bit that I was going to say to you, then that changes us, it shifts our thinking away from quite an outcome-driven idea about what good parenting is. So we just have to get a kid to this stage, phew, done. Oh, got to the next stage, right, great. Oh, they haven't done so well at this stage. It's quite educational kind of focus. Oh, therefore failure as a parent. So I think, so that's a little bit cheeky on your comment, but also the positive bit is I think we have moved a little bit into thinking about the, emotional connection, the relationship. Not quite, I don't know, Margaret could talk about more the kind of the psychosocial, it's not so much my part, but I think that's a positive shift in how we think about relationships and relationality in relation to fathers and children, rather than only, if we get fathers to do this, kids' GCSEs will improve, which is a much more transactional idea about relationships. And to your question, I hope someone else has done more recent reading than me, because I'm a bit out of date and I don't know well enough what the divisions of labour are like among same-sex male partners. And that is an interesting question about whether gender just plays out differently, because the idea of being the stay-at-home dad with a male partner, does that play out differently? I don't know if any of your equal parents, you didn't have any same-sex male couples, do you?
No, we deliberately wanted to study the sort of heterosexual dynamic where there's a heterosexual woman, heterosexual man in the same household kind of thing. So, yeah, it wasn't something that we really covered.
So sorry, I don't know is the answer to that bit.
Yeah, and I think I'm probably in a similar position in relation to that. I mean, I guess it's a little bit sort of out of date, but Gillian Ransom's work Against the Grain included both heterosexual and gay couples that were sort of parenting in sort of non-normal ways, many sort of equal carer relationships. And I'm trying to remember, if I remember rightly, there were some that were very equal and others where they were sort of semi-equal, but there was a sense that they decided that one was going to take on sort of primary carer role, even though it was kind of both were sort of heavily involved. But again, it's probably not something that I'm massively knowledgeable about. To Charlotte's question, so we originally just did our research as a kind of fixed thing, myself and Rachel, on equal and primary carers, and then we sort of, because of the pandemic, actually decided to sort of go back and talk to the fathers 5 years later, and I think we'd really like to do that again if it's possible for us to kind of stay in touch with them. Whether it will be or not, I don't know. And it is a real gap. I think you sort of mentioned teenagers. Fatherhood and teenagers, I think, would be a sort of huge area which I'm not aware of very much research having been done on. And I think it is a gap, and I think there is that tendency to focus on the early periods, and maybe there's a good reason for that, but there's an awful lot that's sort of missing. The childcare stuff you were talking about, I'm not sure if I've remembered this, so I'm probably going to embarrass myself now, but it was making me think of Fraser and the kind of the universal breadwinner model, which is kind of like where everyone goes out to work and everyone gets childcare, versus I think what she might call the universal carer model, which is more the model that kind of everyone doesn't go out to work all the time, and both men and women are sort of doing a significant amount of caring and balancing that with work. And it's kind of a tough debate, isn't it? Because there are problems with just completely relying on childcare, because often it's kind of cheap labour provided often by sort of not particularly well-paid women in many cases. And it could be argued that it sort of plays into the kind of neoliberal system and prevents people from having that kind of balance in various ways. And I guess when I first became involved in this, I was quite sort of convinced the answer is not sort of childcare. The answer is get men to do more care, kind of thing. I think it's actually more complicated than that now. But yeah, I think it's a really sort of interesting thing to raise.
Very quickly.
No, absolutely. No, after your comment, we're going to move to drinks and nibbles. So.
Okay, great. Sounds fun. Although I'll probably fall asleep after last night. But anyway, again, just a couple of observations. I think we need to reflect on the language we use about children and about caring for children. I mean, I know why people use unpaid care, but I don't like it. I think it's very mechanistic. I think I will continue to use it when I need to. But, caring for children, being with children can be terribly joyful, irritating, all the other emotions. So, in our society here, we tend not to... We don't celebrate children enough, I think, actually, at all their ages. And, when people go off on leave, we say, oh, poor you, what a burden, often, rather than, great, you're going to have all this, well, you're not going to have time for yourself, you're going to have time with your kids. And as somebody who's been through that, it's very short, actually, and it sounds this maybe is not right on or whatever, but it's that it passes really quickly. And there are some lovely moments that you remember, and children are fun. They're also very difficult, and they can have problems and all of that. So I just like to think about the language. We can think about our language. I know my colleague Peter Moss hates the phrase childcare, doesn't he? What is it? And wants us to use early education and care. Early childhood education and care. I think that's a hard one to force people to do that. And I understand why we talk about childcare institutions, because, particularly women need help with their negotiation and reconciliation, and so do men, of course, but with the burden of working hours that I think is happening, it's pretty hard for women as well as men. Conceptions of childhood, then, one needs to look at the language, and I mean, Denmark is a fascinating country in many ways. Some people suggest children are parked in the way that you've described, possibly, but then there's all the data on happiness and orderliness and fun. And we've got Danish people in the room. That's also apparent. So something's working, and in Finland as well, something's working in the more complex, in many ways, society. So language, celebration of children. Our government do not celebrate children enough. They don't invest in children. They don't invest in the care of children or the care of caregivers. to children throughout life. And I just say on the same sex and multitude of sexes and fluidities of gender, I think Susan Golombok's book's a great place to start. We are family, and there's people in the room working on that in that area, and there are not enough projects on same male sex, as it were, irrespective of identity, and that's a real gap in the field. I don't think there's a project at the moment. Is that right, Kitty, on this?
Susan Golombok has done some longitudinal studies on two-father families through adoption and through surrogacy in the UK and in the US, and more from a psychological perspective than some of the more sociological perspectives being explored today. Yeah. Any messages to help the room before we finish? Correct me if I'm wrong, Susie, but generally it shows that same-gender couples share childcare more equitably, possibly, than couples who are heterosexual. So they tend to negotiate between themselves about what works best for them, rather than along more like stark primary and secondary caregiver lines. Yeah. Thank you. Well, read that work.
Thank you very much, everyone. So, will you please join me in thanking our panel for such a thought-provoking and entertaining time?
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast.